So yeah, like John said, I'm Madeleine. I'm a Master's of Environmental Studies student at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I've been doing a placement for school this term with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts to create this working document or resource guide about agricultural community land trusts and alternative farmland tenure models. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, John provided a nice land acknowledgement, but maybe just to say that um, I'm coming from Toronto or Toronto, and this is where my school is based, and it's the traditional land of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and today is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Also, just a note on language before we begin, which is that throughout the webinar and the document, the term farmland is used to refer to agricultural land, but want to recognize that this term does not fully encompass the diverse food production and harvesting systems that exist, particularly those practiced by Indigenous communities. And I was inspired by the Cooperative Foodlands of BC organization, who in collaboration with Indigenous partners has adopted the term foodlands to reflect a broader understanding of land-based food systems. And want to acknowledge and appreciate the evolving language and deeper perspectives that it represents. So a bit about this resource guide. Yeah, like I said, I created it as part of a placement with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts and also working with the National Farmers Foundation. We will be sending a PDF of the resource guide out to all registrants and attendees afterwards. There might be a few days delay just to make any final edits or additions based on like feedback or additions from this webinar. But yeah, the resource guide will basically serve as a summary of preliminary research and findings, mostly based on web-based research and scanning and reviewing literature, but that no qualitative methods such as interviews or surveys were conducted. This document has also been informed by discussions and significant input from John of Sundance Commons and Glenn from National Farmers Foundation. And we'll also want to extend gratitude to the CNCLT's Agricultural CLT discussion group for their feedback and thought-provoking questions that have helped shape this work. And just want to say that this document is a work in progress and will continue to evolve as research deepens in partnership with CNCLT and National Farmers Foundation. And hopefully future research can incorporate surveys and interviews and further analysis to expand our understanding of the possibilities of alternative farmland tenure models in Canada. Okay, so why do we need community land trusts or alternative land tenure models in the context of agriculture in Canada? I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I'm assuming attendees have some general understanding of the issues associated with rural land and farmland in Canada. But the first one is obviously that Canada's agricultural system is deeply rooted in settler colonialism. And before colonization, Indigenous nations practiced diverse and complex forms of land-based and land-based food systems and governance systems, and Indigenous peoples were displaced from their lands to make way for settler farming. Discriminatory laws actively prevented Indigenous communities from developing their agricultural economies, and settler expansion deliberately targeted and continues to target Indigenous foodways as a means of control and dispossession. In addition to this, Black communities have also faced systemic barriers in agriculture. Black loyalists, formerly enslaved individuals who fought for the British in the American Revolution in exchange for freedom, were resettled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the late 18th century and promised land and economic opportunity. They instead faced racism and injustice, and the legacy of these injustices continues to shape Black farmer struggles for land access and equity in Canada today, which we can see through the hegemony of predominantly white male settler farmers. It's also important to note that rooted in the civil rights movement, the community land trust model was actually invented by a diverse coalition of Black farmers in the South in the United States. So the first ever community land trust was called New Communities Incorporated. It was established in 1969 in Albany, Georgia, as a radical response to anti-Black discrimination and the ongoing displacement of Black farmers by white landowners. And I provide more details of this story and some links in the resource guide. And then migrant injustice. So Canada's agricultural sector depends heavily on the temporary foreign worker program, as well as the seasonal agricultural worker program, which bring in migrant farm workers primarily from Mexico, Guatemala, and the Caribbean. And these workers often endure harsh conditions and human rights abuses. Farmland loss and industrialization and corporatization of agriculture. So Canada's current agricultural policy maximizes agri-food production and commodity exports, which has led to a corresponding rise in inputs such as fertilizer and pesticides, and the financial benefits are increasingly flowing to agribusiness corporations rather than farmers themselves. Canada is also losing farmland at an alarming rate, as exemplified by the photo on the right of farmland being turned into urban sprawl. So Canada has lost the equivalent of roughly 3 farms per day over 20 years. Something that impacted me growing up, especially in a smaller city where it's surrounded by rural farmland. And as you drive out of the city growing up, the farmland increasingly just is turning into subdivisions and urban sprawl. And then provincial legislation for farmland protection is in place in some provinces, including Quebec's 1978 Act, Ontario's Greenbelt, and BC's Agricultural Land Reserve. While they do offer some protection, farmland speculation, non-farm development, and resource extraction continues to threaten agricultural land. More issues is that farmland affordability and access is a major challenge. 1 in 3 Canadians were farmers in the 1930s, but today farmers make up just 1.7% of the population. Young farmers struggle with high land costs and debt, leading to insecure rental arrangements. And Canada's farming population is also aging, with the average age of a farmer now 57 years old, and only 12% of them having a formal succession plan. So we're going to see an unprecedented turnover of agricultural land across Canada in the coming decades. So clearly there's a need for land justice and new relations to land. Throughout history, many societies have maintained communal and agrarian relationships to land, recognizing it as a shared resource rather than a commodity. And this system of private property has really been imposed by colonialism and capitalism. And finally, there's a need to build a strong local food economy in Canada, as our current system relies heavily on global supply chains, leaving us vulnerable to disruptions like we saw during COVID-19, but also right now with trade wars and tariff wars. Canada's food is exported, most of it. We are a net exporter of food to other countries, but we also import 50% of vegetables and 75% of fruits. So clearly, in the face of these challenges, there's a need to strengthen regional supply chains and produce more locally to improve food security, create jobs, and reduce our carbon footprint and build resilience, et cetera, et cetera. And the image on the right, some may recognize. I thought it was fitting because April 17th coming up is the International Day of Peasant Struggles, initiated by La Via Campesina, which is an international movement that represents small-scale farmers, peasants, Indigenous people, and rural workers. La Via Campesina was founded in 1993, and it advocates for food sovereignty, agroecology, rural communities, defense of workers' rights. And the National Farmers Union of Canada was actually a founding member of La Via Campesina. Fun fact. Okay, so now that we've highlighted the myriad of issues, let's look at some alternative farmland tenure models. So the resource guide primarily focuses on community land trusts to benefit agriculture, but it's also important to recognize the wide range of alternative land ownership models that might also provide effective solutions to the farmland transition and access crisis. But obviously there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and different models may be used independently or in combination with community land trusts, or we might see hybrid models or overlapping models to address specific needs. So I'm going to go through some brief definitions and examples of alternative farmland tenure models. Okay, so just some basics before we start is that some legal structures in Canada are nonprofits, which can be incorporated provincially, and each province in Canada has its own legislation governing nonprofits, such as the Societies Act in British Columbia and the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act here. And nonprofits can also incorporate federally, allowing them to operate across provinces. There's also a charity. So an organization has to first be an incorporated nonprofit before applying to charitable status with the Canada Revenue Agency and operate exclusively for charitable purposes, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And charities can issue tax receipts for donations and have a number of other benefits. And then a foundation. So in Canada, a foundation is a type of registered charity that primarily provides funding to other charities rather than directly operating charitable programs themselves. Okay, so here's some alternative farmland tenure models. So the first one would just be individual or private ownership, where land is owned outright by an individual, but maybe have informal or structured land sharing agreements, such as lease to own arrangements, co-ownership, or just handshake agreements to provide access to others to land without having to own it. These agreements can vary in security and enforceability, making them potentially less stable than a formalized collective ownership model. Some Canadian examples are the South Knowlesville Land Share in Nova Scotia, the Treaty Land Sharing Network in the Prairies, L'Arterre in Quebec, and the Young Agrarians BC Land Matching Program. There are also conservation land trusts, which are nonprofit or charitable organizations dedicated to protecting areas in their natural state, like forests or wetlands, and wildlife habitats. And they do this through acquiring land or placing conservation easements on land or just through stewardship agreements. But sometimes these land trusts protect agricultural land. So I used to work at a conservation land trust called the Couchiching Conservancy in Ontario, and we protected a number of properties that were grasslands, and we would lease the land to farmers for cattle grazing. So these agricultural arrangements do exist with conservation land trusts. Then there's the Community Land Trust, which we'll go a bit more in depth in, so I won't say too much about it here, but it's also a nonprofit or charity that can own and steward land for community benefit. Usually in Canada, it's for affordable housing, but we're going to talk about how it could relate or benefit agriculture. Indigenous land trusts are land stewardship models created by and for Indigenous communities to reclaim, protect, and manage traditional territories. They usually take the form of a nonprofit or charitable organization and can be used to support traditional land-based practices, environmental conservation, housing, language revitalization, culture, food sovereignty, and community development. Photo on the right here is from All Our Relations Land Trust, which also presented as part of this in Soli-darity series last Thursday, I believe. So the recording for that will be on YouTube shortly, but they're an Indigenous land trust based in the Kingston area of Ontario. And then there's a cooperative. So a cooperative is another legal structure for collective ownership and management, where members would purchase shares to access and steward farmland. And cooperatives can operate as either for-profit or nonprofit entities. And each province and territory in Canada has its own cooperative act. So some Canadian examples are Agricola, Cooperative Farm, Firm Cooperative Turnsole, both in Quebec, and Crows Commons Cooperative, which is in Nova Scotia. Also just want to highlight these two reports about Indigenous land trusts in the Canadian context, which I came across, which are really great resources if you want to learn more about them or how to support them. And there are links to those in the resource guide that I'll share. Okay, moving along. So a nonprofit community farm would just be a farm operated by a nonprofit organization with the goal of serving the community or the public rather than generating private profit. Some Canadian examples are Everdale Farm and Just Food Community Farm. These are in Ontario, and then the Sharing Farm is in Richmond, BC. Faith-based farms are farms operated by religious organizations, faith communities, or spiritual groups that would integrate agricultural practices with their faith-based values, usually also taking the form of a nonprofit or charitable organization. Some Canadian examples there. First Nations land-based projects. So these would be anything from farms to pastures, forests, seed sanctuaries, hydroponics, or other food growing and harvesting projects that are owned and overseen by First Nation. Because land on First Nations reserves can't typically be bought or sold, these farms represent a distinct model of land tenure, but they are governed by the Indian Act in Canada. Some examples are 4C farms in Cowessess First Nation. Rama Community Farm is a farm just outside of my hometown where I grew up, near Orillia, and that's the picture on the right is from Rama Community Farm. And the Kentucky Seed Sanctuary is on Tyendinaga Mohawk territory in Ontario. Incubator farms are programs or initiatives that provide aspiring farmers with temporary access to land, training, and resources to help them establish their farm businesses. So these projects are usually run by nonprofits or sometimes governments or educational institutions and aim to support new or underrepresented farmers by reducing financial barriers to land access. So land incubation projects may offer short-term leases, mentorship, shared equipment, and business development support. to help farmers gain the skills, experience, and financial stability needed to transition to a longer-term land tenure arrangement. So some Canadian examples. One is Sundance Commons, which John mentioned that he's a co-founder of. So if anyone has questions about Sundance Commons, you can reach out to John or ask about it during the Q&A, which is in Ontario. And then public land. So this would be government-owned land, either at the municipal, provincial, or federal government level, where land access would be granted through a lease arrangement directly with a farmer or a nonprofit. And some provinces also offer crown land leasing or buying programs for agriculture. So some Canadian examples of public land would be Huron View Demo Farm is in Ontario. The Rouge National Park is in the GTA. The park is federally owned, but they've just recently signed a new master lease with a nonprofit that John is also involved with, so you can ask him about that. And there's also Downsview Park in Toronto, which provides agricultural leases, and then, like I mentioned, crown land. Okay, so final slide. Easements are legal agreements that restrict certain uses of land, such as development. Usually easements are used by nonprofits. So for example, a conservation easement could be used to ensure farmland remains dedicated to agricultural use. So an example of this is the Ontario Farmland Trust here in Ontario. I think they may be looking to actually acquire land, or maybe they have acquired some properties, but up until this point, they've primarily used easements to protect farmland. A legal trust, this one I know the least about, but I understand that it's some sort of legal entity that holds land on behalf of designated beneficiaries. The only Canadian example I could find is the Toronto Islands Residential Community Trust Corporation, which is not used for agriculture. It's used for housing, but it is a legal structure that could potentially be used for agriculture. An eco-village is a type of intentional community where land is typically owned collectively, often by a nonprofit or a cooperative organization. Residents often share resources, decision-making, and a commitment to environmental or social values. And many eco-villages incorporate agriculture or have a farm. An agri-hood and an eco-village, I think, can overlap to some extent, or maybe the lines are a bit blurry between them. But to my understanding, agri-hoods are usually created and owned by private developers and designed as sustainable alternatives to a traditional suburban neighborhood by incorporating farmland. But yeah, it's more of like a planned community by a developer. There's a really good thesis, though, by Martin Strathoff on agri-hoods, which I've linked in the resource guide. And then finally, social utility trust. This is a particular legal structure in Quebec, which is designed to hold and manage assets for the benefit of a social purpose rather than for private profit. Hubert from Protecteur actually presented a webinar in the first part of this in Soli-darity series on the organization Protecteur in Quebec. So you can watch that if you want to learn more about social utility trusts. Okay, so now that we've looked at different alternative farmland tenure models, let's zoom in and look specifically at a community land trust. I won't go too into depth about a community land trust because I assume most people have a general understanding about CLTs, but essentially they're a model of collective land stewardship based on the principle that land should be held and managed for the benefit of local communities. By removing land from the speculative market and holding it in trust, they ensure long-term access and affordability. They're usually place-based in a particular geographic area. Also, community land trusts, although they're called trusts, they're not legal trusts, but rather they're usually just nonprofit or charitable organizations and use legal mechanisms and policies to achieve their objectives about retaining ownership of land and keeping it affordable. CLTs can steward land for a variety of uses, including residential, cultural, community, commercial, and agricultural. Sorry, there's dogs barking upstairs. I'm sorry if you can hear them. CLTs usually use a tripartite governance structure to ensure that interests are heard from different stakeholders, but that no one interest is predominant. So there's usually a board of a CLT is usually divided into 3 equal parts: leaseholders or residents, community representatives, as well as public or expert representatives. And most community land trusts operate on a shared equity model where the trust retains ownership of the land and grants residents long-term ground leases where they can own the homes and buildings on the land, but the ownership of the land itself remains with the CLT. So the photo on the right is Kensington Market Community Land Trust, which is a more famous example of a CLT in Canada. But in Canada, CLTs, I would say, have mostly been used for in urban settings, in urban residential settings for affordable housing. Some existing urban CLTs do own and manage land for both housing and agriculture. So, for example, the Milky Way Garden is owned by Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto. It was their first parcel of land they ever acquired in 2016, I believe. And it's a 7,000 square foot vacant lot in the Parkdale neighborhood and has been operating as a community garden in partnership with a nonprofit organization. But if we're looking at how community land trusts can benefit agriculture in rural communities specifically, we can look a bit closer at this. So agricultural CLTs can be a powerful tool to address land access barriers faced by new and small scale farmers, especially those without inherited land or capital. So in rural models, the CLT would retain ownership of farmland and provide long-term renewable ground leases to farmers, who in turn would own any buildings, infrastructure, housing, or improvements on the land that they develop. This model would provide secure land tenure while allowing farmers to build equity in their homes and farm infrastructure. And crucially, it would keep farmland out of speculative markets and ensure affordability and continuity of farmland for future generations to address the crisis. Housing is a critical component in this model. So on-site housing for farmers would offer them critical stability and ensure more effective farm management. And the integration of farmland and housing together would provide farmers with a rare opportunity, especially farmers without intergenerational wealth, to be able to access both land and housing in a secure and affordable way. So a successful example of this model of a community land trust used to benefit agriculture would be the Waldegrave Farm, which is owned by the Tatamagouche Community Land Trust in Nova Scotia. So the farm operates on a 100-acre property stewarded by Tatamagouche CLT. Around 8 residents live on the land. Some are active farmers, while other residents just support the farm by providing a customer base. And the model includes local food production, shared stewardship, and community living, while keeping the land accessible and protected for future generations. So I provide a link to the story a bit more in depth in the resource guide. But yeah, this is a Canadian example. And then I also want to do a brief case study of a model in the United States, which is called Agrarian Trust. So obviously between the US and Canada, there are some legal differences. Nonprofits in the United States operate under this 501c3 model for nonprofits, whereas Canada does not. So there are some legal differences and considerations, but nevertheless, Agrarian Trust provides a really interesting template for a model that could potentially be adopted in Canada and some lessons to be learned. So Agrarian Trust is a nonprofit dedicated to providing land access for the next generation of farmers in the United States. And in 2020, they launched a national network of agrarian commons, which are essentially community-based landholding entities affiliated with Agrarian Trusts, but operating as kind of their own community land trusts. And they're located in communities across the United States and focused on regional food shed areas. So by what I found that there are currently 14 local agrarian commons in communities in 12 different states across the US at the moment. And I believe Agrarian Trust utilized a model where the 501c3 is associated with Agrarian Trust, but then they use 501c2s and 501c25s. There may have been some legal challenges or changes to the structure, but regardless, there are some really interesting lease samples online and bylaw samples, and also sample land donation agreements, which could be helpful for us to look at here in Canada. And just to say that no such model like Agrarian Trust currently exists in Canada. We have smaller projects across the country, but we don't have one overarching national organization like Agrarian Trust, which is trying to establish community land trusts across the country. So here's kind of a diagram of how Agrarian Trust works. So here in the pink is the National Agrarian Trust. They get donations. and acquire farmlands and then transfer the deed to the farm to a local agrarian commons, which has its own board of community members and farmers. And then the agrarian commons can grant a lease, usually a long-term 99-year ground lease, to farmers who are looking for farmland. And then from there, the food and the outputs of the farm flows into the community and consumers and local farmers markets. Okay, so in terms of lease costs for farmers and building equity, the agrarian commons determines their lease rates differently than market-based or extractive approaches. So they first use direct engagement and collective work between the lessee and the lessor to understand what's affordable for farmers within the context of their specific farm business model and structure a lease rate around that. I found online that as a general benchmark for financial planning and modeling for the agrarian commons, they consider farm lease rates of $5,000 to $12,000 annually, with variations depending on acreage and market-based land value considerations, as well as residential home rental rates if there are residential homes on the property of around $2,000 annually. But it's also noted that the farm leaseholders are always on the board of the agrarian commons that operates and owns the farm that they lease. So the leaseholder is paying their lease payments to something that they are directly a part of, as opposed to paying lease payments to a landlord that's not connected to them or the community. And then in terms of building equity, the question is like, if the farmer doesn't own the land, how would the farmer acquire equity? So Agrarian Commons wrote that the ground lease is the most commonly utilized tool through which the Commons introduces equity building for farmers. Under a ground lease, farmers retain ownership of the buildings and infrastructure that they construct and invest in on the land. So while the farmer does not own the land, the absence of a mortgage payment frees them up to invest in critical infrastructure, which they do retain ownership to. So farmers enter into 99-year leases. And they also mentioned that investments that the farmers make into soil health or their agrarian enterprise or ecosystems or projects can have a collective benefit on the agrarian commons as a whole and can be used to reduce farmers' individual lease payments. So it's possible for farmers to lower their lease rates through improvements they make on the land. Okay, so this model and idea all sounds great and wonderful, but there are some challenges that we face in the Canadian context on how the broader agricultural community land trust movement might be implemented. So I'm going to go through some of the challenges. So the first one is charitable status, which in Canada can offer several strategic benefits to organizations, including allowing organizations to issue official tax donation receipts, and also have reduced land transfer or land donation fees. But the main challenge currently facing nonprofit organizations in Canada seeking charitable status to operate as an agricultural community land trust is whether agricultural activities are considered charitable. So in Canada, the Income Tax Act defines charitable purposes under 4 broad categories. So there's the relief of poverty, advancement of religion, advancement of education, and then there's other purposes beneficial to the community. So the CRA provides a list of other purposes beneficial to the community, a fairly long list, including protection of the environment, providing public amenities, promoting commerce or an industry, addressing problems faced by children or youth. But it's not clear whether agriculture could be considered a beneficial purpose to the community. Because traditionally agriculture in Canada is a business, it's an economic endeavor, so it's difficult to determine whether or not agriculture can be thought of as a charitable purpose. And agriculture itself is not currently written as a charitable purpose in the Income Tax Act. So what has been done on this front? There have been a number of initiatives and organizations setting precedents. So Protecteur in Quebec, which operates under the Social Utility Trust model, initially had their application for charitable status refused because their purposes didn't meet enough criteria from the CRA. So they went back and adjusted their purpose and activities to emphasize the criteria of helping in the development of the agriculture industry. And they highlighted agroecology as the future of sustainable agriculture, and they got their charitable status based on developing the agriculture industry on the basis of agroecology. Additionally, the National Farmers Foundation is currently engaging in legal research geared towards building their understanding of the feasibility of charities to accept and manage land donations, and also the barriers about engaging in Canadian charity law. And they're hoping to set a precedent for Canadian charities seeking farmland tenure transformation, and they have some funding to do this through the Canadian Bar Association. Also in late 2022, there was a petition initiated by an MP in British Columbia to the House of Commons in Canada, calling on the government to make amendments and additions to the Income Tax Act to incentivize the donation of land to community land trusts, using a similar mechanism to the Ecological Gifts Program, which for conservation land trusts provides significant tax benefits. So government response was tabled in May 2023, and the government basically highlighted that CLTs can do this if they're already a charity, but it didn't really address the actual proposal to modify the income tax to make tax exemption for CLTs. So more work to be done on that front. Another option might be for a nonprofit agricultural community land trust to create a separate charitable arm, which would be a different entity dedicated to just the charitable activities of the CLT, while the nonprofit arm holds title to properties. So this model is used in Toronto by the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. So the Neighborhood Land Trust is their charity arm, and then their sister organization is Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which is the nonprofit. So it gives greater flexibility in what they do under charitable purposes and what they do just as under a nonprofit. Okay, another significant issue facing the development of community land trusts for agriculture is funding, capital for land acquisition. So this is one of the biggest challenges in acquiring farmland for organizations, because currently funding for land acquisition is mostly directed towards affordable housing or housing cooperatives or conservation lands, leaving agriculture with limited options beyond loans, such as those offered by Farm Credit Canada. But even with loans, down payment requirements and other income qualifiers can make it really difficult for young, low-income, and newer farmers to qualify for loans. So grants or dedicated land acquisition funds for farmland are virtually non-existent in Canada, and there's a critical need for a land acquisition fund, something akin to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, or the Community Housing Transformation Center in Canada. Another example of a land acquisition fund is actually in the United States. There was a program called Increasing Land, Capital, and Market Access Program. This program, in June 2023, the USDA awarded approximately $300 million for 50 selected projects across the United States, but this has since been discontinued under the Trump administration, but provides an interesting model for a land acquisition fund for farmland. Outside of the nonprofit sphere, some organizations like the National Farmers Union are advocating for a land acquisition program by the federal government. Phil Mount from the National Farmers Union delivered remarks to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture in October 2024, and he was proposing a food shed lands acquisition program. So this program would focus on acquiring prime farmland in peri-urban areas to ensure it remains available for food production and prevent valuable farmland from being lost to urban sprawl or industrial development. Lands would be purchased by the federal government from willing sellers and administered via a federal agency working in collaboration with urban municipalities and other local organizations such as co-ops and community land trusts. And the land would be leased out in small and medium-sized parcels on low-cost terms to eligible farmers, aiming to address barriers such as lack of affordable access to secure tenure for new entrants and other equity-deserving farmers. One idea related to funding capital and land acquisition are community bonds. So some community land trusts in Canada, such as the Ottawa Community Land Trust, as well as the Kensington Market Community Land Trust, are turning to community bonds to fund their acquisitions. A community bond is an interest-bearing loan that a nonprofit, charity, or co-op can issue to support a project they're undertaking. Individuals and organizations can purchase a community bond and earn a fixed interest rate, and their investments would support projects that generate cultural, social, or environmental returns. And this model seems to be showing some success. In 2024, KMCLT raised $1 million and OCLT raised $3 million. Another barrier that we're facing in Canada is municipal zoning restrictions, particularly regarding building multiple housing units on agricultural land because of zoning regulations that often limit residential development in rural areas. There are some promising examples across Canada where municipalities have worked with communities to enable more flexing housing models to support farming and collective living. So on the East Coast, the Tatamagouche Community Land Trust in Nova Scotia, their land is zoned as rural, which allowed them to construct multiple dwellings on their property. And also very interesting on the West Coast, the Yarrow Eco Village in BC, they actually established an entirely new custom zoning code, which is called Eco Village zoning designation, which can include residential and commercial and farming space, which is really interesting. But here in Ontario, zoning regulations remain a really big barrier. Most agricultural zones only permit single-family dwellings associated with farm operations. There have been some organizations in Ontario that have tried to develop a community farm with multiple dwellings and have struggled against these rules. And the National Farmers Union Ontario also highlights some of these barriers in one of their papers on secondary residential housing on farmland, where they highlight that tiny homes and trailers can be more affordable housing options, but on rural properties are illegal under current zoning because they don't meet the minimum home size requirement. So a number of zoning restriction issues. And then finally, just capacity in general, I think in relation to alternative farmland tenure models and community land trusts, we're navigating complex legal and regulatory frameworks around property ownership and zoning and taxation, charitable status, which often demands specialized legal knowledge and access to professionals who understand these nuances of non-market landholding models. And there have been many promising land tenure alternatives that have popped up, mostly by smaller organizations with limited funding, who often struggle to scale or sustain their operations or even secure land in the first place. Okay, so that was a lot of negatives, so we'll try to end it on a more positive note of some things that are going on or next steps. The National Farmers Foundation is engaged in a project around this idea of creating rural agricultural community land trusts, particularly engaging in legal research with some funding, as I mentioned, from the Canadian Bar Association, as well as Catherine Donnelly Foundation. And they're supporting two local groups advocating for the creation of a rural agricultural CLT model, which is Crows Commons in Nova Scotia and the Stratford Affordable Housing Alliance in Ontario. The National Farmers Foundation is also doing work on a database. So they're trying to create a database, a public database of all these alternative land tenure models I've mentioned and more, all existing alternative farmland tenure models across Canada, and actually conduct interviews and surveys with people from these various organizations. And I'm going to be supporting this work as a research assistant over the summer. So I'm excited to see this work carry forward. The Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts also has their Community Resilience Program, which provides funding to support 5 startup CLTs with an equity-deserving group focus to acquire land, and Sundance Commons, which John is a part of, is one of these groups, which is really great to see some funding to support this model and its development. And I also talked to Hubert from Protect Terre, who told me that Quebec is working to establish a farmland acquisition fund that would be crowdfinanced by individuals and have a government tax incentive to encourage participation. So those are just some positive developments going on in this sphere. Really curious if anyone knows of other things going on. Pop it in the chat or feel free to put your mic on if you have any questions or want to share anything moving forward. And yeah, I just also want to say that I'm not an expert on this topic. I've been doing a lot of research, but obviously there are things going on that aren't online or that I don't even know about. So if you feel like anything was missed or misrepresented, feel free to yeah, pop in the chat or put your mic on and begin the discussion. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline. That's amazing. I have a few pages of notes, so I look forward to trying to read my scribble later on. Uh, yeah, we definitely have some time to open it up to questions. Yeah, either in the chat or you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand and I'll try to find you. Um, I do see that there is one question we can go right to. But yeah, feel free to keep bringing in any questions if you'd like. But I see Chloe has a question. I'll read. There's a bit of context. So we're a co-op in Toronto and we're launching a campaign to acquire and convert food banks to form new agri-food co-ops, community-owned farms, micro factories for processing, and grocery stores. We are leveraging community bond campaigns as startup capital. Are there any North American examples of land trusts, co-ops, nonprofits, or charities working together to form cooperative agri-food supply chains?
Cooperative agri-food supply chains. Not that I know of. There have been a number of cooperative, like grocery and food organizations, particularly in Toronto, but I know a number of them have gone under during COVID. The Karma Co-op in Toronto still exists. Um, but specifically for my agri-food supply chains, I don't know of any, but John and Glenn are also here to help answer questions, so maybe if they have any input.
I don't know if it would necessarily be like agri-food supply chains, but I know Chris Newman in the US is a farmer who's been working for years to try to create some cooperative models for poultry, and two, it's somewhat connected to supply chains. I know he recently came out with an ebook about kind of cooperative farming, and there's probably aspects of it that go beyond farming into the supply chain part. So that might be one. Chris Newman, Sylvan Aqua Farms. Um, yeah, that's in the US and near Virginia. Okay. Well, if anyone, yeah, there we go. I see Sam. You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for that presentation. So helpful and interesting. Um, I was just wondering, for some clarification. So it seems like existing land trusts right now, especially on the community land trust model, is the preferred strategy raising capital to um, purchase land, or is there also like a strong soliciting of donations as well? Like, are both of those of land donations directly, or is it more monetary donations to purchase land? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think either one is needed. In terms of like getting land donated, I think it kind of points back to that issue with the CRA that I mentioned, is that it's more favorable to have land donated if you're a registered charity, but there are some barriers for agricultural community land trust to become a charity. Um, so that's an issue. And then in terms of monetary donations, there's a lack of an acquisition fund. So that seems to be an issue. But in terms of like fundraising and community bonds, that's definitely more promising on the fundraising part. And maybe John or Glenn have more input.
I think it was a question I had as well, but the part of succession planning and the general situation in farming is that retiring or aging farmers need to get the equity out of their land because that's kind of their retirement plan. And that's where the challenge is too. So I think there's some alternatives there in terms of, I was actually just reading something yesterday, but there's delaying the kind of getting that lump sum, so there's kind of more, basically creating more alternatives to that transition to be able to acquire. And part of it would definitely have to be selling below like the top market price. So I think there are conversations. I know I used to live at an eco village, so I've kind of met more aging farmers who maybe they don't have children, or for whatever reason they're like, I want to make sure my farm maintains continues to be a farm, even if I don't sell it for the maximum amount of equity that I could. So I think there's those. I mean, they're probably minor considering the grand scale of the succession crisis in farmland, but there's definitely some conversations in that regard too. But I think it's obviously going to be case by case, and it's likely to be a mixture, because even if you got land donated, there's huge upfront costs potentially as well.
I think also there is a lot to be said about trying to build a lot of local relationships in your communities and potentially find those maybe that 1% of people who are philanthropic or would be willing to donate land. I know based on my research, that's a big part of what Agrarian Trust is doing with the Commons is trying to establish strong rural communities and get a lot of community involvement and mutual aid support to get people to be donating land and wanting to be a part of this movement and regional food community. So I think a lot of that is definitely needed, especially in smaller rural communities, in Ontario, at least where I'm from.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. I've seen there's that website called FarmLink that's like a nationwide land matching one. And I was surprised to see the amount of like farmers posting. There's some really cool, interesting stuff on there. In terms of just like the amount of goodwill that is out there on the internet, even for a small internet. So yeah, thank you very much.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been really helpful. I'm an aging farmer, and so we're connected with young agrarians, and we are looking for someone to occupy our farm and garden and live on that property. But I'm also involved with a group here in BC, and they're a very small community, but they have been bought out by an American billionaire who owns 25 titles of farmland in their community. And so I'm really not in the community. I'm more of a peripheral observer hearing about this. And this is quite common throughout probably the world, definitely other places in BC. Has anybody else come across this where farmland is being purchased and the purpose behind it ostensibly is to bring his hunting friends in? Is there elk living, lots of wildlife here to the Robson Valley on the Fraser River? Really desirable land, but it's being it's taken out of agriculture. So we're looking at legislation. We have people from the government interested. But it's a problem. So just hearing about trusts and, I would love to appeal to this billionaire and say, well, why don't you donate this? Go ahead, hunt. There's nothing illegal about that, but let people grow food here because we need to. Is anybody in the group familiar with this problem?
I will say that I know that the NFU has a number of reports about, or at least information in the reports about the issue of like farmland being owned by foreign, like people outside of Canada, and calling on government to enact policies about majority of farmland staying owned by people in Canada rather than foreign owned. I don't know.
There's an added problem because this individual has a company that has 2 Canadians ostensibly owners in it, and so it looks Canadian, but everybody knows it isn't. It's a hard one. I will check out NFU. Thank you.
Yeah, it's tough. These are the issues that we're up against, is corporate control of farmland ownership. I don't know the exact answer, but definitely alternatives are needed and policy change.
Policy change. That's right. Yeah, thank you.
I don't think we're.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, sir.
I don't think we're having exactly the same issue here in Cape Breton, but a very similar kind of thing where there is a lot of land being bought up and often turned into subdivisions or just kind of stashed for investment, and golf courses and other kinds of things. And one of the things I've been thinking about is whether or not getting together with other people and going to the most local level of government, which would be our municipal council, and just trying to talk to them about ways where they might incentivize building differently. For instance, instead of taking big tracts of land and putting in masses of roads and plopping houses here and there? Could we do something that would, and specifically advertise to like people who want to do co-housing, who want to do agri neighborhoods, who want to do the kinds of developments that make more sense, and really just trying to see if there's ways that the municipal councils, the most local level of government, could be kind of get their eyes opened about ideas like, you know, hey, where's our food coming from? So that's, I don't know if that would work out in BC, but that's kind of where I would start if I could do something.
Yeah, it's definitely a very big struggle with the consolidation of farmland ownership, and then the relatively new kind of safe investment and investment firms that are, you know, buying up farmland and then, you know, leasing it out. But that lease is to, for how long, who knows, until it's the right call to make with that investment firm. And then that's kind of broad acre kind of farms, but there's also like just the sprawl, as Madeleine mentioned a few times too, that I think, yeah, I think there's definitely some benefit to looking at the local level, at the municipal level, in terms of just having examples that people can walk by, so they can kind of like have a few years of being like, oh, that's so lovely, like that used to be this, and now it's, look at this, and it's like, well, how did that happen? What is it? And that conversation can get into the bigger stuff. But it is like the challenge is immense in terms of like the farmland access, succession, aging farmers kind of transition. I feel like that's going to take, you know, some real federal policy stuff that's going to be like, this is a crisis, and we're going to deal with it as if it is a crisis.
Yeah. As John
Chloe, I see
mentioned,
you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Madeleine.
I was just going to
All right.
say, as you mentioned about having examples you can look to, I think that's part of the idea with the database that the National Farmers Foundation wants to develop, is having it as a public database so anyone can find projects in different provinces and look to them as models for inspiration. But yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chloe.
Thank you for this chat today. I guess my final question is around, how is the ecosystem of like value-driven businesses working together to recapture the market from corporate interest? Because a lot of these projects have very good intentions, but unless they come together in some form of like coherent machine that can challenge the corporation, a lot of these good intentions will not materialize. As a policy analyst at the federal level, it's very hard for me to comprehend how each group individually would achieve its goal if they're not working together. So I'm just kind of curious, like, with all this talk of like acquisition funds, like different initiatives, like how is the ecosystem stacking or even combining some of these goals together? Because yeah, like there's a new prime minister coming in, and how is this sector going to respond with coherent policy? That's just my final question.
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't know the answer necessarily, but I agree that like having a strong coalition and network working together is very important. Which definitely points to this like the network, for example, the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts, and having a network that people can plug into and tap into where we're connected and forming relationships with each other. I also think unions in general, particularly like National Farmers Union, has like many different locals within each province, and that provides a forum where people are knowing each other and working together, but also advocating for policy change at the provincial and federal levels. Those are just some thoughts, but yeah, it's I agree, it's a huge issue, and I don't know exactly how we're gonna work together, but it's yeah.
Yeah, I could answer that a bit. I mean, I think it's size and scope, and I mean, right now it seems like there are lots of different projects across Canada, and they're small in scale. But I mean, you got to start somewhere. I mean, in the U.S., they started looking at these types of models before we did in Canada, and there are a lot more examples there. and those types of alternative land tenure models are becoming more popular. So it's people are becoming aware that we do have a farm crisis and that our farmers are aging and we have to get younger people back on the land. And we've got this huge farm debt right now that is impacting the economics of agriculture. So I think mindsets will change, and there are a lot of other farm groups in Canada who are advocating for change. So this is the start, and for us just to get some money to do the research and to work with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts is a good beginning.
Sorry, I didn't want to lose. There was a question from Adrian a bit earlier on. I'm just going to read it. What is a suggestion regarding Toronto, Mississauga, and Kingston declaring emergency food crises? So I wonder how that plays into this. And then as well, urban farming on green roofs on commercial and residential properties. Is there a value in a CLT in that regard in terms of urban rooftop farming?
I think definitely like urban rooftop farming is one piece of the puzzle in terms of scaling. I don't know how confident I am in that as a widespread solution across Toronto. I think what's needed is for the green belt, which surrounds the majority of Ontario's population, which is in the GTA, is that land needs to actually be used for farming and feeding people locally in Ontario. A lot of what's grown in the green belt is corn and soy, which is for animal feed, or used for fuel and ethanol. It's the majority of the crops being grown in the greenbelt are not used to feed people who are actually living in the urban centers. So exactly how to do it, I'm not sure, but reconceptualizing the land that we have around the city and how we can use it to feed people is what's needed to address the food crisis.
Yeah, I would just add, what first got me really attracted to community land trust is the community decision making is kind of baked into it with the tripartite board, or there's a few other kind of mechanisms, whether it's a ground lease or equity building mechanisms. But I think you can take some of those, whether it's you're a CLT or not, into kind of more localized, like heavily localized situations, like if there's a group that wanted to start a rooftop garden or something. I'm assuming that's kind of how the Parkdale garden started. It was probably local residents are like, well, this has just been empty and wouldn't it be great if. So I think you could take kind of those structural things, even on like a super grassroots micro level, in any which direction you want. Because yeah, I don't think we should, the problems are pretty massive. And I think when we're talking about huge, thousands of acres of this succession and farmers being like, I don't know what to do, and being over leveraged with their cost, those some things just are going to require like systemic big changes. And then I think you could also do smaller scale stuff that, in the grand scheme of things may seem like a lot of effort for what you get. But I think those little examples do something. They definitely, especially if you're working with a municipality or even you get a few other stakeholders, but it's run by the community. I think that has some power in and of itself that could spread out. I did see a question from Jacob. I guess it was basically thoughts about what you presented, CLTs, but as it relates to food hubs, and maybe you can explain what a food hub is, and whether this kind of model makes sense for food hubs. I think he actually linked a very good article too, if anyone's interested. It might be a study.
He said, I don't have a mic right now, sorry.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, Madeleine, on food hubs itself.
I don't know a whole lot about food hubs. That might be more of a Jacob thing. I've come across them, but I don't know enough to speak about. Glenn, do you have any input on food hubs?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, there's an example here in Manitoba of a food hub, Farweed Co-op, It's looking at an integration type of model, getting farmers to work together and also to collectively market their foods in the general region and area. Um, so, what was the question again? I mean, that's a good model. I think our food systems should look at integration and geographic areas to market our foods. So there was an example in California, the Fresno Food Commons, and it was taking like a corporate vertical integration approach, and they created a regional food hub, and they issued shares to the public to try to raise money. The project happened over 10 years ago, and it wasn't successful, but I think it's still a good model to look at.
I see we have a question from the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts.
Yes. Hello, and thanks, Madeleine. That was awesome. I was very impressed. It was very great. You laid it out really well. I'm only taking up space asking questions because I saw there's no other ones. So I'm interested for my own selfish reasons. I guess what are you, because this was your beginning soft launch of the resource guide. What do you anticipate the full launch is going to bring us? And like, are there any specific gaps or areas you're like wanting to dig into more or and relatedly after this first round of knowledge, what have been some of your main takeaways that are going to inform your next moves? Sorry, I kind of switched my question in the middle of my question, but either way, just curious to hear a little bit of what's coming next. And may I say, this whole conversation has been so interesting and really informative for the network so far. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. I guess when I first started the placement, I thought it could be a simplified report, but then I dug into the scale of the problem and I'm like, whoa, this could take months and years of research. So from here, I'm trying to integrate this more into my master's like major research project. So I'm going to be working as a research assistant with the National Farmers Foundation, helping with the database. And as part of that, we're going to do interviews and surveys with particular organizations across Canada who are working on alternative farmland tenure models. And hopefully I can also utilize that data for my own research and create a larger report, hopefully in partnership with CNCLT and NFF. I'm really interested in just like talking one-on-one with people from these organizations and figuring out like, what are the barriers? What have the opportunities been? Like, what does your model actually look like legally? What legal mechanisms and tools are you utilizing? And also like, once we have an ecosystem of all the organizations across Canada, like, how do we scale from here, or what's next? Or like Chloe mentioned, like, how do we work together to actually fight against corporate powers? So these are some of the themes I'm interested in exploring in larger research. And yeah, also continuing to join the CNCLT's agricultural discussion group, which anyone can join if you'd like, but I find that a useful forum to like connect with other people across the country and figure out what people are facing and what kind of projects they're working on.
Cool, thank you.
Sarah?
I just wanted to say there is a food hub here in Cape Breton, and vaguely what they started doing was they transport food to one place. They open ordering on, I forget, a certain day. You have a couple of days to order online, and then they bring the orders to different communities. And that's the model they were using when they started. And now they actually have a building so that if you are within reasonable distance, you can go and buy directly there. But one of the great things is that they get money from maybe the government or food banks, so that and sometimes from people who join the food hub, so that they can provide kind of like market bucks to people so that they can buy the food. And in their new building, they have now got a chef and processing facilities. So it's like not affordable for me, but it's great that they're providing locally grown, they're, you know, providing a market for locally grown food because it's spread out all over the island, and that they're processing it into soups or, you know, frozen vegetables right here. So I like that a lot. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll just read Nike's comment here. I would love to see a case for support that, I would love to see a case for support that folks can take to their local planning committees to advocate for multi-unit housing on agriculturally zoned plus rurally zoned land. Our land use bylaws just changed, and that's a new hurdle for us. Yeah, I think that's one interesting thing. When I was reading, I don't think I finished it, but Martin Strahoff's Masters on Agri-Hoods, that's where I first heard the term development supported agriculture, and the idea of not seeing them as like always kind of at odds, that it's either development or agriculture. I think, I know most of my experience in agriculture is small scale, you know, agroecology, vegetables, fruit, small amount of livestock, not broad acre, but I think there's, yeah, there's a lot of potential for reimagining housing in rural spaces that would help with rural revitalization as well, that I think would actually be beneficial agriculturally as well as ecologically. So I think this like tension of, you know, development, that's maybe big picture. I could see that being the case, but I think if we look farm by farm or properties by properties, we could see that there's, you know, there's a little bit of nuance there that would probably be beneficial. And I think, not to always talk about CLTs, but I think CLTs have that idea of, you know, that they're housing, which just kind of leads me into a question I was curious about, is maybe it's something that would be expanded on, or if you have any thoughts, Madeleine, on the research, but two things is one is a little bit more on cultural CLTs, because I do see like agricultural CLTs kind of blending a few elements of all different types of CLTs, and they're not just agricultural. Like if you've been to a farm party, you know, they're you know, they're not just party, they're like activities, it's fun, you know, there's a few things. And I think people, that's part of it. So that's one thing about cultural CLTs, what that looks like, how that would maybe relate to this stuff. And then as well as like kind of the challenge when we're talking about the like exorbitant cost of farmland is succession planning, and that's kind of its own industry. And what does that look like? And can CLTs play a part in that? If you've even come across any of that research, not to throw you a last second curveball.
Yeah, I guess the cultural piece I mostly was looking at through like Indigenous land trusts as well as like Black-led community land trusts. The CNCLT has a webinar all about Black-led community land trusts in Canada, which I was watching some of. That was interesting. Maybe Nat can speak to more of it. I believe the CNCLT went on a tour across Canada and US of different Black-led community land trusts, which is really interesting. I don't know if Nat can speak to that. But also when I was doing research on the Agrarian Trust, they had a story about one of the local agrarian commons was for a Somali Bantu community, and they had like a liberation farm program. I think it was based in Maine, and they were trying to provide land access and food security for like a Somali Bantu community, especially with their cultural roots as generational farmers. So lots of interesting and inspiring stories related to culture, and I think like having culture embedded in the mission or the goals of acquiring land makes it so much stronger and meaningful and easier to rally people around. And I can't remember the second part of your thing. So
Just about succession planning for farmland.
I didn't find a ton of it, just like the fact that only 12% of farmers in Canada have a succession plan, which is alarming.
No.
But I mean, hopefully CLTs could help provide an option or a resource towards help you with succession planning. I don't know if CNCLT has any resources about succession planning. Nat, do you know?
Not like in those terms, but we just released like a really introductory things to consider when donating property from the donee and the donor's perspective. So I'll drop that in the chat.
Yeah, I wonder, Madeleine, if you had any questions. I feel like I might have taken over Nike's comment about kind of CLTs or any of these alternative models, how they could relate to better organizing to deal with municipalities in terms of zoning stuff, like a little bit of that aspect, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, just about Nike's comment about planning committees or a local group that would advocate for multi-unit housing or agriculturally zoned plus rurally zoned land. Our land bylaws just changed, and that's a new hurdle for us.
Yeah, I guess working with the municipal, like from what I was reading with especially Yarrow Eco Village in BC, when they got their Eco Village zoning designation, like they were specifically working with, I think, Chilliwack in BC, like working with the municipality and trying to like work through this language and work through what it could look like to have an eco village zoning. So I guess trying to work, like municipalities have land use planning staff that are experts in these topics. So I guess trying to work with the municipality where possible, but also in Ontario, I feel sometimes we have issues of the province overriding things. I don't know if this is a thing in other provinces, but especially with conservative government in Ontario, like municipalities are creatures of the province, so sometimes the provincial policy statement or different provincial policies will trump local municipal regulations, which is frustrating. Yeah, those are just something.
I'm thinking step one is to invite the municipal staff to a farm party or the council. Invite council to the farm party. They're going to be on board. Sorry, I'm not the expert clearly on this call.
Nike.
I was just going to add on to my comment, I guess. Mostly what I wasn't sure if it was clear enough what I wrote, but essentially at Crows Commons, we want to develop more housing. And our bylaws just changed so that we're now, instead of just being general use, where essentially you could kind of do whatever you wanted without approval, other than meeting the building code. Right now we're rurally zoned. And so now there's limitations on the amounts of units we can have. I think you can have 4. And this was like, they were going to have 2. And then we did a lot of noise making and we can have 4 now. And they do have exceptions. Like, of course, they're allowing larger farm businesses with migrant workers to have large, like, you know, those are like substandard housing units. So I think that there's like an understanding that you need housing if you're going to have farming, but they're not really, I imagine in our future, a lot of the work that we'll be having to do is like meeting with those planning committees, advocating for why the type of housing that we're doing is important in our zoning. And I was just thinking of the CNCLT being like, maybe that's a resource, because so many of these zoning bylaws are honestly like copied and pasted. I know they're sort of different, but the same kind of advocacy tools would be really effective. Yeah, I don't know. That was what I was saying. I was like, is that something that the network would create that then I don't have to create in the future?
I mean, I can speak and say that, like, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, like anything kind of shared in this call it can influence like what we're up to at the network. And I think that you know, that's why the agricultural working group is also an interesting space to kind of collaborate on different activities. I would say, like, yeah, this is definitely a useful tool. I could see how it would be useful. And we support it. Yeah.
Something else interesting that I've come across is there's like a smaller, I guess, kind of eco village type in Oro-Medonte, which is outside of Orillia here in Ontario. They created this in like the 70s or 80s, so things are probably very different, but they had a huge piece of farmland, like 100 acres or something, and they wanted multiple residential units to form some sort of eco village. I think they're a cooperative technically, but they ended up having to sever the farmland into like 18 individual plots, but also have a communal farm. which was like, I think they had to fight it in the Ontario Land Tribunal to even get that far. But I guess, have you, like Nike, I'm wondering if you've thought about trying to sever it into multiple different parcels of land, just have homes on each of them, but then also still operate as if the land is one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what we've been working towards is like trying to resist the need to continually divide up into these sort of like colonial property lines, and a lot of the kind of housing that we want to create already, the planning committee has had difficulty trying to understand what that looks like because we're designing from like a trans and disabled perspective, and so the housing and everything from like the septic is set up in a way that there's sort of just a different culture of living. Like so many of the housing designs that are approved are like single family home with a lot of like difficulty around multi-generational use and other types of cultural living. So I think we were specifically trying to avoid the need to subdivide continually to have these like hyper individualistic like plots. But I understand what you're saying, and like totally creative solutions, and I feel like we'll have to work around it in some ways. I was just appreciative also of the way that you brought housing into the conversation, because that's a big piece of what we're trying to look at, even though we're in the farming world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a huge piece. And I know I feel conflicted about it too. Like on one hand, it's a creative solution, but I'm also against the severing of farmland. And we have some pretty strict municipal zoning in our rural townships that prevent severing farmland. So yeah. But I see
I
Ellie.
see Ella may have a question or a
Yeah,
comment.
I apologize. I had it marked down that it was 2 o'clock and we were in the barn. I apologize that I'm coming late. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we've really worked on this. We formed a small community land trust, and then we tried to get charitable status, and we wanted to buy back my parents' farm. And we sort of planned it that we could, make some housing in the barn and convert the chicken house, basically make it really good housing though, like really good quality, and then share housing. But the the federal government said that's not charitable. We were going to try and help new farmers get started on shared land. But I don't know if I missed it. Have you talked about whole village? Because whole village, what they did is the way they are able to be communal is they built their home like a wagon wheel. And where they are, I think it's Simcoe County, they were only allowed one stove. So the stove's in the central area. And people, I think, buy sort of like almost like condo units. These are these spokes of the wheel. And they don't have an oven, but they're all one house. And that's how they were allowed in that municipality to exist. Another thing, we've always done market gardening. Now we do more herbs and conservation, stuff like that. But we've always had people live with us. And we find after a while, especially if you're a couple, you want your own space. So people need, to have their private kitchen and bathroom. And it also reduces conflict. People need to have their space. So we just found that especially during the summer, you can live with less. We live with much less space. But if you have a door that opens between you and a unit, it's not really an official apartment, but you're living together, but they have their own unit. So I think you can be creative about how people live together. And I think it's really important that people have their own space for you to, prevent conflicts. People just need that, especially if they have a child or a partner, they need that space. So that's what we've tried to create on our farm.
John, did you want to say anything about whole village? Because I know you lived/worked there.
Yeah, I definitely lived there for 5-ish years. Yeah, that's accurate. It is in Caledon. But yeah, they set a legal precedent in terms of what constitutes a single family dwelling. And it was pretty expensive legal fees, but it was around a ratio of square footage. I think it was 60-40 common space to private space. So everyone has suites and then only one working full kitchen. But you're also allowed an apartment. So they had one member that was a couple with many children, so they made their apartment a full kitchen as well. So they had 2 full kitchens. One is a communal one. That was also that there was 2 plots of land that, and this might have been from the previous owners, were fused together through an easement. So there is an old farmhouse on site as well. but yeah, they that's definitely set like a legal precedent. It was quite costly, but also that was a huge cost in terms of setting that up. I think, and they originally wanted to do tiny homes and everyone do their own thing, and that was just never going to happen, mostly because of neighbors complaining before they actually had an idea what was happening. But I think they probably saved a lot of money too as well by making it one single building. Yeah, I think, yeah, there's a lot to learn there too as well, from communal living, that could be helpful. Yeah, I think part of this too is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Things have changed a bit too since they first set up, because now, you know, with Ford, basically he's allowed the additional dwelling unit. And
Mhm.
I don't know if your dwelling unit can be a duplex. Can your home be a duplex? So that could maybe be 4 units. You can also have a granny flat, so that's 5 units. So, I mean, the rules have changed a bit for you to be a bit creative.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that part of that is just the idea of working like you know, there's land acquisition funds. There's these big talks about doing them. Always kind of making sure there's space for rural affordable housing as well, and to reimagine farms that aren't like the nuclear family will be getting this 100 acres of rectangle and doing one crop there, and to really see the ecological but also the social aspects of affordable housing in rural spaces. Because some of these costs are pretty exorbitant for, especially for someone who's a new farmer or a bunch of new farmers. So I think there's room there to always advocate for rural spaces as well.
And then there's
I don't
Mennonite
want to have
homes.
the last word. Perfect. Go ahead, Ella.
Yeah.
We're
The
almost done.
Mennonite
So
homes are, you know, if you look in the Mennonite areas, like those homes are gigantic. They just keep growing and growing and growing. But I think the rules that municipalities have is you have to be related. You can only have, you can't have more than 5 unrelated people in the house or something, or I don't know if those rules are changing.
yeah, I think that's what the legal precedent at Whole Village says, that there you can't base it off of that because it's discriminatory. So no one's related at Whole Village, but how do you constitute what a single family dwelling is? And they're like one working kitchen. I don't know if different municipalities are allowed to kind of affect that, but yeah, we're just at 2:30. If there are any other questions, you definitely have some emails if you wanted to reach out. We're all of us more than happy to answer any questions, continue the dialogue. We will send out an email as well with when the recording is available and the handout. And of course, if you want to join the agricultural discussion group, that email is out as well. But that'll all be in a wrap-up email as well. So definitely keep in touch, and thank you so much for yeah, thank you so much for participating. Yeah, I feel like I could go on forever, at least for myself. But yeah, I want to thank everyone on behalf of the CNCLT. Maybe I'll just leave a little bit of time for Madeleine to say some goodbyes, but I want to just be very thankful and appreciative of all the work you've done. It's been amazing to learn.
Thanks so much. Yeah, just thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to CNCLT for the collaboration, and NFF and John and Glenn. And saw some friendly faces, some familiar faces on here, some new and old friends and family. So thanks everyone.